Welcome to History to Relax, the place where the past unfolds slowly, one gentle step at a time. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Sit back, rest your shoulders, and let the noise of the day slip quietly away. If you enjoy these long journeys into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We love hearing the many places our stories travel to. Tonight's tale is a little different from what movies and legends have taught us. We are going to step carefully into the world of medieval warfare, not the shiny, choreographed battles of Hollywood, but the real thing. We'll hear what the battlefield actually sounded like, discover how armor was lighter and more agile than you might think, learn why swords were not the most important weapon, and see how sieges, starvation, and money shaped war just as much as knights and lances. Across 15 chapters, we'll explore the myths and the realities, the chaos of command, the role of peasants and women, the truth of chivalry, and the end of the medieval battlefield itself. It is not always glamorous, but it is fascinating, a window into a world of courage, confusion, and survival. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let the story carry you into the heart of the Middle Ages. Not as we imagine it, but as it really was. Part 1. The Sound of Battle. When most people think of a medieval battle, their minds fill with images shaped by movies. We see neat lines of knights in polished armor, the dramatic clash of swords, and the echo of a trumpet calling men forward. It feels almost choreographed, like a dance of steel under a wide-open sky. Yet the real medieval battlefield was not a place of tidy movements or elegant duels. It was, above all, a world of noise, overwhelming, confusing, and often terrifying. To stand in the middle of it was to be swallowed by a storm of sound. The first sounds began long before weapons met. Imagine thousands of boots trudging through fields, iron greaves clanking against each other, and horses neighing, stamping, and snorting in restless energy. Soldiers carried shields and spears, and every step caused wood to creak and metal to rattle. Men spoke in low voices, some whispering prayers, others joking nervously to mask fear. Already, before a single arrow flew, the air vibrated with a dull hum of humanity, like the sound of a marketplace, but darker, heavier, charged with dread. When the signal came, a horn, a drumbeat, or a shouted command, the soundscape shifted. Trumpets might blast, deep and brassy, their notes distorted in the open field. Drums rolled in uneven rhythm, carrying across wind and hills. Commanders shouted orders, but words were often lost in the chaos, forcing men to rely on banners, hand signals, or simply on copying the man next to them. Confusion was constant. Many soldiers admitted afterward that they never truly heard their leader once the battle began. And then came the clash. Forget the clean clang of swords in films. Real steel on steel was harsher, almost like hammers striking anvils. The crunch of metal biting into wood echoed again and again as spears struck shields. Arrows hissed through the air in swarms, a noise often compared to rushing rain or a sudden storm wind. When they landed, they made dull thuds, or the sharper crack of shafts splintering. The battlefield quickly became a chorus of violent percussion, every sound layered upon the next until it became a roar that pressed into your skull. But not every sound was martial. There were screams, not heroic shouts, but raw, panicked cries. A wounded soldier howled in agony as he clutched at an arm or leg. Horses shrieked when struck, a piercing, almost human-like sound that chilled men to their core. Somewhere, a commander bellowed to rally his men, his voice hoarse and desperate. Over it all, men gasped for breath, coughed through dust and smoke, or groaned as they strained against their armor's weight. These were not the tidy grunts of actors. They were the uncontrolled noises of human bodies in pain, fear, and exhaustion. If you closed your eyes, the battle would sound less like an orchestra and more like a thunderstorm trapped in a valley. Booming, rolling, unpredictable. You would hear bursts of sharp crashes, like lightning splitting trees, and beneath it the endless rumble of shifting men and animals. It was not music, it was chaos. And that chaos had consequences. Soldiers often could not tell friend from foe in the noise. Many struck wildly, guided only by movement in the corner of their vision. Miscommunication was rampant. Some units charged too soon, others too late, not because they disobeyed orders, but because they could not hear them. This confusion also explains why medieval warfare relied so heavily on flags, banners, and visual signals. On a field where sound collapsed into an overwhelming storm, vision offered the only chance at coordination. A knight did not always know what his commander wanted him to do, but he could see his banner moving across the field. In a sense, the silence of a raised flag shouted louder than any words. And yet, there was another kind of sound, one that rarely appears in movies. After the clash, after the first furious minutes, battles often slowed into grinding stalemates. The shouting dulled into panting, groaning, and the wet smack of blades against flesh. Men grew too tired to scream. Instead, there was heavy breathing, the rattle of shields trembling in weary arms, and the distant crackle of fire as wagons or tents burned on the edges of the field. Silence never truly came, but the pitch of sound sank, like a storm breaking into steady rain. What makes this soundscape even more striking is how alien it would feel to modern ears. We live in a world of mechanical noise, cars, engines, sirens, machines. A medieval man did not. For most of his life, sound meant natural things: wind in the trees, birdsong, church bells, market chatter. A battlefield was unlike anything he had ever heard. The sudden intensity of metallic clashing and human screaming was not background noise, it was an assault. Many chroniclers describe men running simply because they could not endure the noise. Some commanders even used sound as a weapon. The Mongols carried drums the size of carts, beating them in rhythm to terrify their enemies. European knights often shouted war cries, both to inspire themselves and to disorient their foes. Noise was not just a byproduct of battle, it was part of its psychology. And at the end, when the dust cleared and the survivors staggered from the field, a strange quiet would fall. For men who had lived through hours of deafening storm, the sudden stillness was eerie. The groans of the wounded seemed louder in the silence. The crack of crows picking at the field carried far. And for some, the memory of the battle's roar would linger in their minds for the rest of their lives, haunting them like an echo that never stopped. So when we picture medieval battles, we should not imagine neat choreography set to music. We should imagine being caught in a storm of sound so intense that it disorients, terrifies, and overwhelms. The battlefield was not just a place of blood and steel, it was a place of deafening confusion, where the noise itself could decide who held their ground and who fled. This is the truth that films rarely show, that war was not only about courage and skill, but about endurance in the face of overwhelming chaos. And among all the weapons on the battlefield, none struck more deeply than the storm of sound itself. Part 2. Armor wasn't as heavy as you think. When most people imagine a knight, they see him as a kind of human tank. Hollywood has trained us to believe that once a knight was sealed inside his steel shell, he was almost helpless, clanking around in slow motion, unable to climb on his horse without a crane, doomed to topple over like a turtle if knocked down. It is an image that has entertained audiences for decades, but it is also one of the greatest myths about the medieval battlefield. The truth is both stranger and far more impressive. Medieval armor, especially the full plate armor of the later Middle Ages, was not only protective, it was carefully engineered to allow a surprising degree of freedom. Knights trained to fight, ride, and even run while wearing it. Rather than being awkward prisons of steel, these suits were technological marvels, the product of centuries of craftsmanship and adaptation. First, let us address the weight. A full suit of plate armor, the kind worn in the 15th century, usually weighed around 20 to 25 kilograms, roughly the same as a modern soldier's combat gear. spread evenly over the body. This weight did not press on the shoulders or drag at the waist, but was balanced so that a fit knight could move with surprising agility. He could mount his horse without help, walk miles if needed, and fight in close combat for extended periods. Medieval chroniclers even record knights running, leaping into saddles, and performing acrobatic training exercises while armored. It was strenuous, yes, but not crippling. Compare this with the image in film: knights staggering under impossible loads, collapsing helplessly when they fall, struggling like beetles on their backs. The reality was far less comic. Knights were professional warriors. They trained from childhood, accustomed their bodies to the weight, and built up the endurance to wear armor for hours. They would never have accepted equipment that left them helpless. It would have been a death sentence on the battlefield. Another myth is that armor was stiff, like being locked in a metal coffin. In fact, it was articulated with incredible care. The joints were protected by overlapping plates connected with leather straps, rivets, and sliding mechanisms. Elbows bent, knees flexed, shoulders rotated. Armorers designed it so that a knight could crouch, lift his arms above his head, and even roll on the ground. The craftsmanship was so advanced that historians have compared it to medieval robotics, moving machines of steel designed around the human body. Chainmail, used earlier and often worn beneath plate, was equally misunderstood. It looked heavy and clumsy, but it too spread its weight evenly. It was flexible enough to allow free movement, though it did not absorb blunt impact well. That is why it was often paired with padded garments and later with plate. The result was not a suffocating cage, but a layered defense that balanced protection and mobility. There is also the matter of heat. Yes, armor could grow hot under the sun, and knights sometimes risked overheating. But beneath the metal they wore padded gambesons, quilted jackets that both cushioned blows and wicked away sweat. On campaign, knights learned how to pace themselves, remove pieces when not in battle, and rely on their squires to help maintain comfort. It was not easy, but it was manageable. Again, these were professionals, not amateurs. What really weighed knights down was not the armor itself, but exhaustion from battle, the endless strain of holding weapons, absorbing blows, and moving across mud or uneven ground. After hours of fighting, even the fittest warrior would falter. But the same was true for lightly armored men. Fatigue was the universal enemy, not steel. The myth of knights needing cranes to mount horses is especially absurd. The image comes from modern reenactments where poorly fitted armor or overweight replicas make movement clumsy. In reality, knights vaulted into saddles with practice. Manuscripts and training manuals from the period even depict knights performing elaborate combat drills while fully armored. Far from being helpless, they were athletes in steel. Armor was also designed for versatility. Pieces could be swapped, removed, or reinforced depending on the battle. A knight in a joust might wear extra plating on his chest and shoulders, but strip it down for open combat. Infantry soldiers might wear partial armor, combining breastplates with helmets and gauntlets, leaving legs free for mobility. There was no one-size-fits-all suit, but a flexible system adapted to circumstance. Another overlooked detail is how armor shaped the psychology of battle. To wear it was not only to gain protection, but to project intimidation. A knight gleaming in steel looked larger, more powerful, almost superhuman. Enemies often feared the sight of a wall of armored men advancing, their polished surfaces flashing in sunlight. The sound of armor clanking, deliberate, heavy, metallic, added to the aura of menace. In this way, armor was both practical defense and psychological weapon. Even so, it was not invulnerable. Arrows, spears, and especially crossbows could pierce weak points. Maces and warhammers were designed to dent and crush armor, sending shock through the body. Polearms could hook and pull knights down. Armor made survival more likely, but it did not guarantee it. That is why knights trained relentlessly in grappling, wrestling, and close combat. because battles often came down to wrestling an opponent to the ground, then finding the chinks in his defense. What may surprise modern listeners most is how graceful armored combat could be. Medieval fight manuals, many of which survive, show knights performing elegant moves, twisting, sidestepping, striking with precision. The armor was not a cage but a second skin of metal, and skilled warriors treated it as such. Watching them was not like watching clumsy robots, but more like watching athletes in protective gear, moving with focus and discipline. At the end of a battle, knights did not collapse in exhaustion, unable to move. They removed their helmets, drank water, and leaned on their squires, just as modern soldiers do after combat. Their armor, scratched and dented, told the story of the fight, but it did not imprison them. Instead, it was proof of survival, a shell that had absorbed blows they themselves might not have withstood. So when we think of medieval knights, we should put aside the cartoonish image of men trapped in iron prisons. They were warriors whose armor was a finely tuned balance of protection and freedom. It was not their weakness but their strength, a technology that allowed them to stride into battle with confidence. And while the movies may laugh at the idea of a knight stuck helpless on his back, the truth is that such a man would not have lasted long enough to be remembered. The knight was no clumsy turtle, but a trained athlete of steel. His armor was not a burden but a tool, crafted to preserve life and grant freedom on the battlefield. And in that balance between weight and movement, we glimpse the true genius of medieval warfare, one that Hollywood's myths have long hidden from view. Part 3. The myth of the sword-dominated battlefield. If you were to judge the Middle Ages by the way movies tell it, you would think every man in Europe carried a sword at his side and that battles were simply great waves of gleaming blades crashing together. The sword, in film and legend, has become the ultimate symbol of medieval war, elegant, deadly, and heroic. From King Arthur drawing Excalibur from the stone to cinematic knights dueling in slow motion, the sword reigned supreme in popular imagination. But on a real medieval battlefield, swords were not the star players. They were, in truth, backup weapons, prestigious, yes, but secondary to the arms that truly decided victory. The battlefield was ruled not by shining swords, but by the long reach of spears, the weight of polearms, and the deadly rain of arrows and bolts. The myth of the sword tells us more about storytelling than it does about history. Let us start with practicality. A sword is a short-range weapon. Its reach is limited, its strikes require proximity, and its power depends on the strength and stamina of the individual wielding it. Against an opponent armed with a spear twice as long, the swordsman is already at a disadvantage. On battlefields where ranks of men stood shoulder to shoulder, the spear or pike was far more useful. A wall of spear points could hold back cavalry, break charges, and press enemies from a safer distance. The ancient Romans knew this, the Greek hoplites knew this, and medieval soldiers knew it too. In fact, the spear was the most common weapon of medieval Europe. Cheap to make, easy to train with, and effective against both man and horse, it equipped not only professional soldiers but also militias and levies. Farmers could be handed spears and quickly form defensive lines. Entire towns were defended by spear walls. When chronicles describe hosts of peasants joining lords in war, spears were the tool they carried. The humble spear was the workhorse of medieval combat, far less glamorous than a sword, but far more essential. Then there were polearms, halberds, glaives, bills, and other terrifying hybrids of spear and axe. These weapons combined reach with cutting and hooking ability. A halberd could slash, stab, and pull a knight from his horse. A billhook could drag down a shield or slice through armor gaps. These polearms dominated infantry combat in the later Middle Ages, especially in the hands of disciplined militias like the Swiss, whose pike formations broke knights and reshaped European warfare. And let us not forget the bow. Archers could decide battles long before swords ever came into play. The English longbow, famously used at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, rained thousands of arrows onto enemy ranks, thinning them before they even reached the melee. Crossbows, slower to reload but brutally powerful, pierced armor and terrified knights. Armies invested heavily in missile troops because they knew that whoever controlled the sky of arrows often controlled the outcome. Why then has the sword become so legendary? Part of the answer lies in symbolism. Unlike spears or axes, swords were expensive. To own one marked a man as wealthy or noble. Swords were passed down as heirlooms, named like companions, and blessed in ceremonies. Kings were crowned with swords at their side. Religious rituals invested them with meaning. In short, the sword was not just a weapon, it was an emblem of authority, honor, and knightly identity. Literature and poetry reinforced this myth. The Chansons de Geste, the Arthurian romances, the epics of knights and heroes, all placed the sword at the center. No bard ever sang of a hero's trusty billhook, no legend tells of a king drawing a spear from a stone. The sword, elegant and deadly, lent itself to metaphor and story. It became the icon of chivalry, even if it was not the most practical tool of war. Movies and television inherited this tradition. A sword fight is cinematic. Two actors clashing blades makes for clear, dramatic storytelling. A wall of spearmen pressing together, or archers loosing endless volleys, does not provide the same romantic image. So cinema, like medieval poets, chose the sword as its symbol. Audiences today, just like listeners centuries ago, are drawn to it. But understanding the reality gives us a different perspective on medieval battles. Instead of knights dueling endlessly with swords, imagine spear walls grinding against each other, arrows hissing through the air, polearms hooking and dragging men from horses. The sword flashes here and there, in the chaos of broken lines, in the desperation of hand-to-hand struggle, but it is not everywhere. It is rare, precious, and personal. Even the smallest weapons mattered more than we think. Daggers, for instance, were crucial in finishing fights. When knights were thrown to the ground, their opponents often used daggers to stab through armor gaps at the armpit, visor, or groin. Brutal, close, and ugly, these small blades were often more deadly than the noble sword in the confusion of battle. This does not mean the sword was unimportant. On the contrary, its very scarcity made it powerful. To see a knight raise his sword in command or in challenge was to see authority embodied. To receive a sword in knighting was to be marked as elite. And in private duels or small clashes, the sword was often the weapon of choice. But it was never the backbone of medieval armies. That role belonged to simpler, longer, and often cheaper weapons. If you were to stand on the field at Agincourt, the last thing you would notice would be swords flashing. You would hear the hiss of arrows, the thunder of horses, the crash of polearms. You would see shields splinter, spears shatter, and men wrestle in the mud. Only when the lines broke and men were locked in brutal chaos would the sword come into play, and even then, it would not be the romantic dance of cinema, but desperate hacking, thrusting, and grappling at arm's length. So while the sword remains a symbol, and a beautiful one, the truth of medieval battle belongs to other weapons. Spears held the lines. Bows won the distance. Polearms tore down knights. Daggers delivered the final blows. The sword was the badge of status and the companion of the knight, but it was not the king of the battlefield. The myth of the sword tells us much about our longing for heroes and stories of honor. But the real medieval battlefield was shaped by simpler, deadlier tools: the spear, the bow, and the axe. To understand this is to see war not as a duel of noble blades, but as a storm of practical, brutal weapons wielded by men whose lives depended not on legend, but on reach, strength, and survival. Part 4: Horses and the Truth About Cavalry Charges. Few images in all of medieval storytelling are as dramatic as the cavalry charge. We picture armored knights thundering across a field, lances lowered, horses galloping shoulder to shoulder, smashing through enemy lines like a living avalanche. In the movies, infantry scatter instantly, flung aside as if made of paper, while the mounted warrior rides on untouched, a vision of unstoppable force. The truth is far more complicated. Cavalry was indeed powerful, but not invincible. Horses were not reckless missiles to be fired into walls of spears. They were living, breathing animals with instincts of their own, instincts that shaped the way cavalry actually worked in medieval warfare. Understanding this changes not only how we picture battles, but how we understand the relationship between man and animal in the age of knights. First, let us talk about the horse itself. A medieval war horse, often called a destrier for knights, or a courser for lighter combat, was not an ordinary farm animal. These horses were carefully bred and trained for war, larger and stronger than everyday breeds. They were taught to tolerate the clash of steel, the roar of drums, and the sting of arrows. A knight's horse was, in many ways, as much a warrior as the man who rode it. And yet, for all its training, a horse was not mindless. No matter how brave, no horse would willingly gallop full speed into a solid wall of spears or shields. Instinct for survival was too strong. This is why the classic Hollywood image of knights charging straight into pike formations is misleading. In reality, cavalry charges were carefully timed and targeted. Commanders aimed their horsemen at weak points, flanks, disorganized troops, or enemies already shaken by missile fire. Cavalry was devastating when used to exploit disorder, not to smash against unbroken lines. Horses could trample fleeing soldiers, ride down scattered archers, or shatter units already wavering. But against a disciplined formation with long spears braced in the ground, cavalry often faltered. History gives us countless examples of this. At battles like Courtrai in 1302, Flemish infantry armed with pikes held their ground against waves of French knights, turning the so-called unstoppable cavalry into a broken, muddied mass. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish spearmen in tight schiltron formations repelled repeated English charges, proving that discipline and reach could withstand the thunder of hooves. These were not isolated flukes, they were lessons. Cavalry was powerful, but only when used wisely. So what did a real cavalry charge look and sound like? Imagine it from the ground. At first, there is a low rumble, faint and distant, like a storm building on the horizon. The earth trembles as dozens, then hundreds, of horses break into trot. Dust rises, banners flap in the wind, and the sound grows until it is a rolling thunder. Lances lower, sunlight flashes on metal, and the noise becomes overwhelming, a blend of hooves pounding, riders shouting, and armor rattling. It was designed not only to hit but to terrify. The sight alone could cause men to lose nerve, drop their weapons, and run before contact was even made. When the cavalry did strike, the impact was indeed brutal, but not always the clean, cinematic crash of lances splintering on breastplates. Horses did not gallop headlong into solid walls, but they could punch into looser groups. Infantry lines broke under the sheer momentum and the psychological shock. Riders swung swords, axes, or maces down at men below, taking advantage of their height. Horses themselves could kick, trample, and shove. The chaos that followed often decided the battle. Yet knights did not rely on brute force alone. Cavalry had different tactical roles depending on the battle. Sometimes they launched shock charges. Sometimes they skirmished, harassing with javelins or crossbows before retreating. Sometimes they pursued fleeing enemies, cutting them down to ensure the rout became permanent. And sometimes they dismounted altogether, fighting on foot alongside infantry when terrain or circumstance made it wiser. The image of knights always charging from horseback is another exaggeration. Many battles were fought with knights dismounted, their horses kept behind lines for pursuit or retreat. And then there is the matter of cost. Horses were expensive. To lose one was devastating to a knight's wealth and fighting ability. A destrier could cost as much as a small estate. Knights valued their animals and protected them with armor just as carefully as they armored themselves. mail and later plate guarding shielded necks, heads, and chests. Horses were not expendable missiles, they were prized partners, investments of years of training and fortune. This partnership meant that knights formed deep bonds with their mounts. Chronicles tell of riders weeping for fallen horses, or of horses refusing to abandon wounded masters. These stories, whether embellished or not, remind us that medieval war was not just man against man, but man and beast together. The horse was not a mindless tool, but a creature whose courage and fear shaped the flow of battle. So why do movies get it so wrong? Because the full, careful reality of cavalry does not fit into the spectacle of cinema. Audiences want the thunderous, unstoppable charge, the dramatic clash of horse against man. What they rarely see is the waiting, the hesitation, the maneuvering for position. Real cavalry warfare was as much about psychology as impact. The terror of the oncoming charge mattered as much as the actual blow. The best commanders knew this and used cavalry at exactly the moment when enemy morale was weakest. Think again of Agincourt. English archers weakened the French with endless volleys of arrows. Muddy ground slowed the advance. Only then, when formations were disordered and exhausted, could mounted knights strike, and even then, much of the fighting was done on foot. The horse was a weapon, but a selective one. And we should not forget the lighter cavalry. Not every horseman was a heavily armored knight. Many were light riders, scouts, and skirmishers, using mobility rather than sheer weight. They darted along flanks, disrupted supply lines, and spread fear behind enemy lines. Cavalry was versatile, adaptable, and far more varied than the movies admit. When the day was won, and the dust settled, cavalry remained the arm that pursued the broken enemy. This was perhaps its deadliest role. Infantry could stand and fight, but once they turned to flee, only horsemen could chase them down. What the charge began, the pursuit finished. For many medieval armies, this was when the true slaughter came, not in the clash, but in the chase. So, the cavalry charge was never the unstoppable hammer that broke every defense. It was a tool, powerful when used wisely, disastrous when used recklessly. Horses were not suicidal machines, but living allies who demanded respect and care. The thunder of hooves inspired terror, yes, but it was discipline, timing, and psychology that decided whether the charge succeeded or failed. The truth of medieval cavalry is subtler than legend. Horses and riders together formed a weapon of fear, force, and finesse. But they were not the almighty tide of steel we see in film. Instead, they were one part of a larger, complex battlefield, sometimes decisive, sometimes defeated, always bound by the will of man and the instinct of beast. Part 5. Castles and Sieges. When you think of medieval war, your mind probably leaps to the battlefield. Armored knights clashing in fields, banners snapping in the wind, swords flashing under the sun. But the truth is that most medieval warfare was not about those rare, dramatic encounters. The real grind of war was in the sieges, where armies surrounded castles and towns, waiting, starving, and slowly breaking down defenses. Far more men died in mud-filled trenches outside stone walls than in any glorious cavalry charge. A castle, after all, was not just a residence. It was a weapon. Thick walls of stone, towers for archers, and gates bristling with iron spikes turned even a small garrison into a formidable opponent. Taking a castle by storm was expensive, bloody, and often impossible. So most commanders did not try to storm them at all. Instead, they surrounded them and waited. This waiting could last months. Imagine an army camped outside a fortress through winter rains or summer heat. Tents sagged in mud, fires smoked, food supplies dwindled. Soldiers dug ditches and built wooden palisades to protect themselves from sudden sorties. Rats scurried through the camp, spreading fleas and disease. The longer the siege, the greater the suffering, often more from hunger and illness than from enemy weapons. Dysentery, typhus, and simple malnutrition killed silently, thinning armies without a single sword being raised. For those inside the walls, life was no easier. At first, defenders might feel confident, looking down from battlements at the enemy camp. But soon the pressure mounted. Food stores dwindled. Water supplies, often drawn from wells within the walls, could be poisoned or cut off. Animals were slaughtered, grain rationed, and eventually hunger gnawed at stomachs. Chronicles tell of desperate garrisons eating horses, dogs, and even leather. In extreme cases, famine drove people to far darker measures. The romantic image of defenders heroically holding out hides a truth of fear, disease, and despair. Weapons of siege warfare were as inventive as they were brutal. Engineers rolled forward siege towers, great wooden machines taller than castle walls, filled with ladders and archers. Men inside pushed them forward under a rain of arrows and boiling liquids. Battering rams swung back and forth, smashing at gates with thunderous force. Mines were dug beneath walls, timber supports burned to collapse entire sections of fortification. And of course, there were the trebuchets. These mighty engines hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds across astonishing distances. A single well-aimed shot could bring down walls or smash through towers. But they hurled more than stone. Chronicles describe dead animals, burning pitch, even diseased corpses being flung over walls to spread terror and plague. To stand on the ramparts and see such things flying toward you was to feel dread not just of death, but of corruption. Yet even these machines rarely won a siege outright. They were part of a larger picture, softening defenses, breaking morale, and keeping pressure constant. In many cases, castles did not fall because the walls crumbled, but because the people inside gave up. Hunger and despair were more effective than stone or steel. Movies love to show boiling oil poured down on attackers, but this, too, is mostly a myth. Oil was expensive and rarely wasted in such a way. Defenders were more likely to drop stones, boiling water, or quicklime dust to blind enemies. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained constantly. Every approach to the walls was a death zone, which is why attackers often tunneled, starved, or tricked their way in instead of charging directly. Trickery played a bigger role than many realize. Gates were bribed open, guards betrayed their lords, supplies were smuggled in by night. In some sieges, the drama ended not in a heroic last stand, but in whispered deals and quiet surrender. War was not only fought with swords, but with hunger, gold, and patience. Consider the famous siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade. It was not won simply by storming the walls. It was a grinding ordeal of thirst, heat, and desperation. The final assault only succeeded after massive siege towers were dragged into place and defenders exhausted themselves holding wave after wave at bay. By the time the walls fell, both sides were broken by suffering.
Or look at the Siege of Orleans in 1429, where Joan of Arc became famous. The French did not smash through the walls immediately. They endured long attrition, morale rising and falling, until Joan's arrival inspired new determination. Siege warfare was as much about spirit as stone. A single leader's presence could tip the balance after months of stalemate.
For the common soldier, a siege was monotonous misery. Days blurred together with guard duty, digging, waiting, and eating thin rations. Arrows might fly from the walls, but most hours passed in dull hunger. Disease crept through crowded camps. Corpses piled up. Many men who marched off dreaming of glory found only a long, slow death in a ditch. For civilians trapped inside, the siege was often hellish. Townsfolk who had taken refuge behind walls became hostages to fortune. Parents watched children waste away. Bakers stretched flour with sawdust. The stench of waste filled narrow streets as clean water ran out. And when surrender came, it brought no guarantee of mercy. Some garrisons were spared, others massacred. Civilians sometimes bore the worst of it, paying the price for wars they never chose. Castles themselves evolved in response to these struggles. Early Motte and Bailey wooden fortresses gave way to stone keeps, then to concentric castles with multiple layers of walls. Each new design forced besiegers to invent new tools. The arms race of wall and machine shaped centuries of war. By the later Middle Ages, cannons began to appear, blasting apart stone with thunderous force and rendering once impregnable castles vulnerable. But until then, the siege remained the central reality of medieval conflict. It is worth noting that most wars did not end with great battles at all. They ended with sieges. A captured castle meant control of a region, authority over its people, and security for supply lines. Knights might dream of glory in the charge, but kings and lords knew the true prizes were walls, gates, and towns. Whoever held them, held power. So when we picture the Middle Ages, we should not see endless cavalry duels in open fields. We should see men waiting in camps, staring at stone walls, shivering under rain, and slowly wasting away from hunger. We should see the tense silence before a gatehouse as a spy opens it from within, or the roar of joy when a trebuchet finally cracks a tower. We should see patience, misery, and endurance, the true weapons of siege warfare. The battlefield may have given us our legends, but the siege gave us the reality. It was not the sword, nor the lance, nor even the knight that decided most wars, but the wall and the hunger that gnawed at those inside it. And in that slow, grinding struggle, the truth of medieval war reveals itself. Less a clash of heroes, more a contest of patience, disease, and despair. Part 6. Fire, Oil, and Myth. One of the most enduring images of medieval warfare comes not from the battlefield, but from the walls of a castle. You've seen it countless times in movies. Defenders standing above a gatehouse, tilting massive cauldrons, and pouring boiling oil onto screaming attackers below. The liquid splashes across shields, men howl in agony, and ladders fall as the crowd scatters. It's dramatic, terrifying, and wonderfully cinematic. But as with so many images of the Middle Ages, this one is more legend than truth. The boiling oil myth has stuck in popular imagination, but in reality, oil was far too precious and expensive to waste on enemy soldiers. A medieval lord was unlikely to sacrifice his household stores of olive oil just to splash it on a few unlucky attackers. What really fell from the walls was often far less glamorous, but in many ways, more brutal. Let us start with what defenders truly had at hand. Stones. Every castle wall was built from them, and every castle yard had them in piles. Large, heavy rocks were one of the simplest and most effective weapons for those on high ground. Drop a stone the size of a loaf of bread from 50 feet onto a helmet, and you could crush skull and bone. Entire wagons of rocks were stored during sieges specifically for this purpose. Attackers with ladders lived in constant fear of the sudden thud of stone smashing shield and shoulder. Then there was boiling water. Unlike oil, water was cheap and plentiful. Heated in great cauldrons, it could scald exposed flesh, soak through clothing, and cause terrible burns. More importantly, hot water could weaken wood, soaking ladders, shields, or siege equipment until they became slippery, warped, or heavy. Quicklime was sometimes added to water, creating a mixture that burned skin and blinded eyes when splashed. These were cruel but effective measures, far more likely than mythical rivers of olive oil. Sand also played a part. Chronicles describe defenders heating sand or fine ash over fires until it was scorching hot, then pouring it through murder holes onto attackers. The grains sifted through cracks in armor, searing skin as they slid into collars, sleeves, and eye slits. Unlike water, which cooled quickly, sand held its heat, continuing to burn long after it was thrown. Soldiers dreaded this invisible rain more than arrows, for there was no shield against it. Fire, of course, was a weapon, but not quite in the way movies show. Defenders hurled flaming pitch, resin, or tar-soaked bundles to ignite siege towers or battering rams. Buckets of burning material were flung with catapults. Arrows were wrapped with cloth and set alight before being shot into enemy machines. Fire was a siege's great equalizer. Wooden structures could undo weeks of work in a matter of minutes. Imagine standing inside a ram, hearing the sudden roar of flames above, and realizing the roof was catching fire. Panic spread quickly, and often defenders relied on that fear as much as the flames themselves. But again, these weapons were used sparingly and strategically. Boiling liquids required fuel, preparation, and risk to the defenders carrying them. Fire could backfire, literally, with sparks landing on one's own wooden gates or roofs. So while these methods existed, they were not constant waterfalls of flame, but targeted strikes. The architecture of castles itself tells us much about these practices. Gatehouses were built with murder holes, small openings in the ceiling through which defenders could drop missiles onto intruders trapped below. These holes were ideal for stones, water, or sand. Defenders also built machicolations, stone balconies with openings in the floor, from which they could drop projectiles directly down the walls. These features were not designed for endless buckets of oil, but for a wide range of nasty surprises. Another overlooked part of this story is the role of archers and crossbowmen. While we imagine sieges dominated by boiling liquids, most casualties actually came from arrows and bolts fired from towers and walls. A rain of sharp steel, loosed from height, was far more efficient than trying to scald dozens of men one bucket at a time. Defenders positioned archers behind crenellations, firing safely while attackers struggled to raise shields and climb ladders. Psychological warfare also played a part. Defenders sometimes hurled grotesque missiles, rotting carcasses of animals, offal, or even human remains. These not only spread disease but also demoralized attackers. To march under the stench of decay, knowing that sickness might be as deadly as arrows, was to fight both enemy and nature. The famous use of plague corpses by Mongols at the siege of Kaffa in 1346 shows how disease itself could be turned into a weapon. So why does the myth of boiling oil persist? Partly because it is such a vivid image. Fire and boiling liquid fit perfectly into the drama of siege warfare. A single splash tells a story on screen in seconds. By contrast, the slower grind of stones, arrows, hunger, and disease is harder to portray in a film. Audiences crave spectacle, and oil provides it. Literary tradition also plays a role. Medieval chroniclers, eager to dramatize sieges, sometimes exaggerated the exotic weapons used by defenders. They described vats of burning pitch, mysterious chemical mixtures, or streams of molten lead. These stories, half-truth and half-theatrical flourish, grew in the retelling. Later generations took them at face value, and eventually Hollywood made them literal. The truth, however, is that medieval siege defense was practical and resourceful. Defenders used what they had: rocks, water, sand, firewood, and human ingenuity. Their goal was not to create spectacle, but to survive. And in many cases, the simplest tools proved the deadliest. A stone dropped from a tower could kill just as effectively as a sword. A bucket of hot sand could blind a knight as permanently as a spear. A burning log could halt a siege tower worth months of work. For the soldiers beneath the walls, this reality was terrifying in its own way. Imagine climbing a ladder, shield raised above your head, sweat dripping under your helmet. Arrows whistle around you. Suddenly, a hiss of scalding water pours over your shoulders, seeping under your armor. You scream, lose your grip, tumble backward into the mud. Or imagine standing in the shelter of a battering ram, hearing stones thudding above, and then a sudden rush of fire as burning pitch falls through the cracks. Panic spreads faster than flame, and men scatter before the gate even shudders. This was siege warfare as it truly was, not endless cauldrons of oil, but a cruel mix of simple tools used with precision, aimed at breaking not just bodies, but morale. For in the end, most castles did not fall by force alone. They fell when men decided they could not endure another day of climbing ladders under burning sand, or sleeping in trenches full of disease, or watching their engines ignite again and again. The myth of boiling oil gives us drama, but the truth gives us humanity. Defenders did not waste precious oil in rivers of fire. They relied on stone, water, sand, and fear. These were the real weapons of the wall, and they remind us that medieval war was not just fought with swords and lances, but with the simplest tools turned into instruments of terror. Part 7. The role of peasants in war. When we imagine medieval war, we often picture it as a contest between knights in shining armor, clashing with swords and lances, their banners streaming in the wind. It is a glamorous vision, full of heraldry, duels, and honor. But like so many myths of the Middle Ages, it leaves out most of the story. For every knight in plate, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, of peasants standing beside him, behind him, or pressed into service around him. Medieval war was not just the business of nobles. It was also the burden of the ordinary farmer, the townsman, the villager who had little choice but to march when called. In truth, peasants formed the backbone of medieval armies. Lords could only afford a limited number of professional knights and men-at-arms. To field a truly large host, they turned to the levy, the feudal obligation that required peasants to take up arms for a certain number of days each year. When war came, villages emptied of their able-bodied men, who gathered with spears, bows, and axes to fight for their lord's cause. Of course, these were not elite warriors trained from childhood. A peasant with a spear had nowhere near the skill or equipment of a knight. But numbers mattered. A wall of spearmen, even if untrained, could hold cavalry at bay. Archers, many drawn from the lower classes, could rain death on armored foes. And peasants were adaptable. Farmers already knew how to use tools that could double as weapons, from scythes to billhooks. What they lacked in polish, they made up for in practicality. Take the English longbowman, for example. The backbone of England's victories in the 100 Years' War came not from nobles, but from yeoman archers, free peasants trained from youth in the use of the bow. Laws required practice on Sundays, ensuring generations of common men could shoot with deadly accuracy. At Crécy and Agincourt, it was these archers, not knights, who broke French armies. The muddy fields were littered not with noble jewels, but with the bodies of knights brought low by thousands of arrows fired by men who, in peacetime, tilled the soil. Peasant militias also played vital roles in cities and towns. Urban guilds provided soldiers during crises, arming themselves with whatever weapons they could afford. In places like Flanders and Switzerland, peasant and townsman militias grew so skilled and organized that they defeated knights outright. At Courtrai in 1302, Flemish militias, many of them weavers and tradesmen, crushed the French chivalry, their pikes holding firm against charge after charge. Such victories shocked Europe, challenging the notion that nobility alone controlled the battlefield. But peasants were not only fighters. They were also the labor force of war. In sieges, peasants dug trenches, built fortifications, and manned siege engines. They carried supplies, drove wagons, and fetched water. War demanded immense amounts of logistical support, and peasants provided it. Without their labor, armies could not move, eat, or fight. A knight might shine in battle, but his glory stood on the shoulders of countless villagers carrying sacks of grain and barrels of ale. The costs of war fell heavily on peasants as well. Armies marching through countryside lived off the land, which usually meant stripping it bare. Fields were trampled, livestock stolen, homes burned. Villagers often found themselves supporting whichever army passed by, whether friend or foe. For them, war meant hunger and ruin far more often than glory. It is no wonder that many peasants fled into forests or fortified towns at the approach of soldiers. The sound of hooves and horns did not mean honor, it meant hardship. Peasant soldiers also endured the worst of the fighting. Poorly armored, often barefoot or in worn shoes, They faced cavalry and professional troops with little more than hope and courage. Their mortality was high, their chances of reward slim. A knight might ransom a captured noble, but peasants were rarely spared. Many battles ended in massacres of common soldiers, their lives considered expendable in the brutal logic of war. And yet, their contributions were indispensable. Without levies, no lord could field an army of meaningful size. Without archers and pikemen, no knight could hold his ground. Without laborers, no siege could succeed. The myth of the Middle Ages as a chessboard of noble knights obscures this deeper truth, that peasants carried the weight of war. Even when not fighting directly, peasants were bound to war through taxation. Lords raised money by taxing their tenants, extracting food and coin to fund campaigns. A poor villager might never step onto a battlefield, yet still feel the pain of war in empty granaries and higher dues. War rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the castle walls. Some peasants resisted. Revolts broke out when burdens grew unbearable. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 drew part of its anger from endless taxes to fund wars in France. In Flanders, peasant uprisings tied directly to the strain of providing armies for noble causes. These rebellions remind us that peasants were not silent pawns, but people with their own breaking points. Even religion tied peasants to war. Priests preached holy causes, calling ordinary men to crusade. Pilgrimage and war blurred together, and peasants marched long distances under the banner of the cross. These crusading armies were not just knights on horseback, but throngs of villagers carrying simple weapons, driven by faith, fear, and promises of salvation. We must also remember the role of women in peasant communities during war. When men marched away, women managed farms, tended livestock, and kept villages alive. They endured the strain of feeding both their families and the armies passing through. And sometimes, they took up arms themselves, defending towns when no one else could. War consumed the whole community, not just the men called to fight. So while knights captured the imagination, peasants carried the burden. They filled the ranks, dug the trenches, hauled the supplies, and paid the taxes. Their sweat, hunger, and blood formed the hidden foundation of every campaign. Without them, medieval war would not have been possible. Part 8. The Chaos of Command. When we watch medieval battles in films, the commanders seem almost like chess masters. They sit on horseback at the edge of the field, giving clear orders, and the soldiers obey with perfect timing. Lines advance, cavalry charge, archers release volleys exactly when told. Everything moves like clockwork, guided by the steady hand of the general. It is a comforting vision of control. But in reality, medieval command was rarely so neat. More often than not, it was chaos. The medieval battlefield was not a quiet place where orders could be calmly delivered. It was a storm of sound and confusion. Commanders shouted until their voices broke, horns blared, drums rolled, and banners waved in the wind. Yet much of it was swallowed by noise. Once the fighting began, orders were often lost, garbled, or ignored. Armies did not always behave as their leaders intended. In fact, battles were as likely to collapse into confusion as to follow any carefully drawn plan. Part of the problem was communication. There were no radios, no instant signals, no reliable way to carry complex instructions across a battlefield. A commander relied on messengers, boys or squires racing on horseback, trying to deliver orders before the tide of the fight swallowed them. Many were killed before they arrived. Others reached their target only to find the situation had already changed. By the time a message traveled across the field, it could already be useless. Flags and banners were meant to solve this problem. Every lord carried his own standard, held high above the field so his men could see where to rally. A banner could tell soldiers where their leader stood, or when to advance or retreat. But banners had their own limitations. Dust, smoke, and the sheer crush of men made them hard to see. If a banner fell, whether because its bearer was killed or because panic swept the unit, soldiers often broke, believing their leader lost. Entire battles turned on the sight of cloth vanishing into the crowd. Another difficulty was discipline. Medieval armies were rarely the professional, drilled forces we imagine from later times. Knights fought with pride and independence, sometimes charging ahead before orders were given, eager for glory or plunder. Levi troops and militias often panicked at the first sign of trouble. Holding a formation was difficult, and once it broke, restoring it was nearly impossible. A battle line that looked solid at dawn could dissolve into scattered groups by midday, each fighting its own desperate struggle. Consider the Battle of Hastings in 1066. William the Conqueror's forces clashed with the Anglo-Saxon shield wall of Harold's army. At one point, Norman troops broke and fled. The Saxons, thinking victory near, chased them, only to be cut down when the Normans rallied and counterattacked. Was this maneuver planned, or simply the chaos of battle turned into opportunity? Historians still debate it. What is clear is that once men began to run, control slipped from commanders' hands. At Crécy in 1346, the French knights charged English lines again and again, despite heavy losses to longbow fire. Chroniclers suggest many of these charges were not ordered but driven by pride and confusion. Each wave galloped forward, ignoring signals to regroup, and the result was catastrophic. No matter how skilled the commanders, the noise and fury of battle could drown out reason. Even within units, the chain of command was fragile. A lord might give orders to his captains, but whether those captains could keep their men steady was another matter. Levi soldiers often had little loyalty to distant kings. They followed their local lords, and if he fell, they might scatter. Feudal armies were webs of personal loyalties, not centralized machines. This made them strong in diversity but weak in cohesion. The terrain added another layer of chaos. Thick forests, rolling hills, and muddy fields broke lines of sight. An order to advance could send men stumbling into ditches or colliding with allies. Once a formation lost its shape, friendly units might mistake each other for enemies. In the heat of melee, even banners could be misread. Confusion bred mistakes, and mistakes bred disaster. Psychology, too, played its role. Fear spread faster than any command. A rumor shouted across the field that the king was dead, that reinforcements had arrived, that a flank was collapsing, could unravel entire armies. Once men believed the battle was lost, it often was, no matter what their leaders shouted. Few commanders had the authority to turn fear into courage once panic set in. We must also remember that many commanders were not distant observers but direct participants. Kings, lords, and knights often fought in the thick of the melee. While this inspired men, it also meant leaders could be cut down, captured, or simply lose track of the wider field. At Poitiers in 1356, King John II of France was captured in the crush of combat, his army collapsing around him. A commander in the melee was brave, but he was also blind to the bigger picture. And yet, despite all this chaos, some commanders learned to use it. Skilled leaders gave simple orders, easy to follow even when noise and fear clouded judgment. They drilled their men in repeated, predictable actions. They relied on reserves to exploit moments of confusion, striking when the enemy faltered. Above all, they adapted. Medieval command was not about precise control but about reading the chaos and nudging it in one's favor. For the ordinary soldier, this chaos was overwhelming. He might begin the day in a neat line, shield in hand, listening to his captain. But within minutes, dust filled the air, horns blared, and the order of battle dissolved. He fought whoever appeared in front of him, trusting that his comrades still stood somewhere nearby. Victory or defeat was often invisible to him until the moment came to flee or pursue. So when we picture medieval war, we should not imagine perfectly orchestrated armies moving like chess pieces. We should see a storm of noise, dust, and confusion, where leaders struggled to be heard, where banners wavered like fragile beacons, and where battles often turned not on strategy but on panic, chance, and the stubborn courage of men holding their ground. The myth of perfect command gives us comfort, the sense that someone, somewhere, was always in control. But the truth is that medieval battles were messy, unpredictable, and fragile. Commanders did not conduct symphonies of war. They struggled to shout above the chaos, hoping their men heard them at all. And in that chaos, the fate of kingdoms was decided. Part 9. Weapons that weren't quite what you think. If there is one thing the movies have taught us about medieval warfare, it is that weapons were always oversized, brutal, and swung with impossible strength. Knights wield swords the size of lampposts, peasants swing axes that could split a tree in two, and every blow seems to knock men flying across the field. The Middle Ages in popular culture often looks less like history and more like a fantasy role-playing game. The reality of medieval weapons, though, is far subtler and far more interesting. Let's begin with the most famous, the sword. We have already seen how it was not the main weapon of the battlefield, but even when used, it was not the clumsy, two-handed doorstop that films portray. Most swords were surprisingly light. A typical arming sword of the High Middle Ages weighed between 2 and 3 pounds, about the same as a modern baseball bat. Even the larger long swords of the 15th century rarely exceeded 4 pounds. They were designed for speed, balance, and precision, not for exhausting swings. A knight could fence with one for hours, making quick thrusts and measured cuts. The great sword as crowbar myth comes largely from fantasy, not fact. Axes tell a similar story. The battle axe is often shown as a giant, double-headed monstrosity, but such weapons were rare, if they existed at all. Most medieval axes were practical, single-bladed, and designed for efficient strikes. Many were not much larger than woodcutting axes, easy to swing in tight formations. The Danish axe, a two-handed weapon with a long shaft, was impressive in size, but still far from the ridiculous slabs of steel shown in modern fantasy. Its edge was razor-sharp, its handle flexible, and its power came not from bulk but from leverage. Maces and war hammers are also misunderstood. They are often depicted as crude bludgeons, swung wildly to crush armor. In truth, they were carefully engineered tools. The mace concentrated force at a small point, allowing it to dent plate and transfer shock through armor. War hammers often had a spike on one side, perfect for piercing gaps in armor. These were not random clubs, but precision weapons designed for specific tasks. A knight might use a sword in one fight and a hammer in another, depending on his opponent's armor. And then there were polearms. To modern eyes, they look awkward and unwieldy, long shafts with strange blades or hooks at the end. But they were among the most effective weapons of the age. A halberd could stab like a spear, chop like an axe, and hook like a grappling tool. A billhook could pull riders from their saddles or tear shields aside. These were versatile, brutal, and beloved by militias and professional soldiers alike. Their reach gave them a huge advantage against cavalry and armored foes. The bow and crossbow, too, deserve more respect than cinema often gives them. Archery was not just about dramatic last-minute headshots. It was about volume, rhythm, and relentless pressure. English longbowmen could fire up to 10 or 12 arrows a minute, creating clouds of missiles that broke enemy morale long before melee began. Crossbows, though slower, delivered devastating power. Their bolts could pierce mail and sometimes even plate at close range. Cities and castles valued crossbowmen highly, often protecting them with pavises, great shields planted in the ground. Far from being mere supporting troops, archers shaped battles. And then we come to the weapons rarely shown at all, the dagger and the knife. These were not glamorous, but they were deadly. In the chaos of melee, once knights fell to the ground, daggers found their way into armpits, visors, or joints in armor. Manuals of the time show techniques for wrestling an opponent to the ground and finishing the fight with a thrust to the weak spot. For all the grandeur of lances and swords, it was often the short blade that delivered the killing blow. Siege weapons, too, deserve to be seen in their true form. Trebuchets were not just giant catapults flinging rocks dramatically into the distance. They were precision engines of destruction, capable of hitting the same spot on a wall repeatedly until it cracked. Engineers designed counterweights with astonishing care, balancing ropes, pulleys, and levers. Their power was immense, but their accuracy was equally remarkable. A skilled crew could focus on a single tower and bring it down within days. Another overlooked weapon was fire. Not just flaming arrows, but barrels of pitch, resin, or tar. Fire terrified soldiers, not only because it burned flesh, but because it consumed the very machines built to protect them. Imagine hiding under the roof of a battering ram and suddenly hearing the crackle of flames above. Fire was not flashy, but it was devastating. Even simpler weapons deserve mention. Clubs, staves, and stones, crude tools in desperate hands, killed as effectively as any forged blade. In peasant uprisings, scythes were adapted into polearms, flails turned from farming tools into battlefield weapons. War was not always fought with elegant steel, but with whatever lay at hand. The ingenuity of ordinary people turned everyday implements into instruments of survival. So why do the myths persist? Partly because of drama. A sword the size of a man is more cinematic than a well-balanced long sword. A battle axe as wide as a door looks more frightening than the modest, deadly tools of reality. Fantasy has exaggerated medieval weapons into symbols of power, and those symbols have overshadowed the truth. Yet the truth, when seen clearly, is no less fascinating. Medieval weapons were practical, efficient, and brutally effective. They were not toys, nor were they clumsy. They were the carefully honed tools of professional killers, adapted over centuries of trial and error. For the soldier who carried them, these weapons were not symbols but lifelines. A well-made spear might mean the difference between standing against a cavalry charge and being trampled under hooves. A sharp dagger might mean survival in a muddy grapple. A balanced sword might save a knight's life in the swirl of melee. Each weapon carried stories, scars, and memories of the men who wielded it. The myth of oversized swords and monstrous axes entertains us, but the truth tells a deeper story. Medieval weapons were not clumsy instruments of fantasy, but precise tools of war, designed to meet the brutal realities of battle. To see them clearly is to understand not only the weapons themselves, but the men whose survival depended on them. Part 10. Death, Injury, and Survival. When we think of medieval battles, our minds often leap to the moment of impact, the clash of steel, the splinter of shields, the flash of swords. Films show men struck down instantly, lifeless with a single blow. Death seems clean, dramatic, and final. But real battlefields told a very different story. Most wounds were not instantly fatal, and most deaths did not come from the clash itself. Instead, survival or death often came slowly, through bleeding, infection, disease, or neglect in the days that followed. The first truth to grasp is that medieval weapons, while brutal, were often less immediately lethal than we imagine. A sword slash might cut deep, but unless it struck a vital artery or organ, it was survivable. A spear thrust could pierce armor gaps, but even then, men sometimes lived through it. Maces and hammers crushed bones and caused concussions, leaving men disabled but not always dead. The battlefield was filled with groaning, bleeding survivors, not just corpses. Armor also changed the equation. A knight in plate was surprisingly well protected. Many strikes glanced off or left only bruises. But bruises could be debilitating. Imagine being hit by a mace that dented your armor inward. The blow might not pierce your skin, but it could crack ribs, collapse lungs, or leave you breathless and stunned. A man might stagger away apparently alive, only to die hours later from internal injuries. For ordinary soldiers with little armor, wounds were more severe. Arrows and crossbow bolts pierced easily through cloth and leather. Cuts to arms, legs, and faces were common. Yet even here, survival was possible. The human body is surprisingly resilient, and many men lived through shocking injuries. What decided their fate was less the wound itself than what happened afterward. Here lies the great enemy of medieval survival: infection. Without knowledge of bacteria or antiseptics, wounds festered quickly. Dirt, rust, and fabric carried into the body by weapons turned cuts into fevered sores. Battlefield surgeons, often barbers or clerics pressed into service, did what they could. They stitched, bandaged, and cauterized wounds with hot irons. They poured wine, vinegar, or honey into cuts to clean them, sometimes with surprising effectiveness. But far too often, infection set in. Red streaks crawled up limbs, fevers burned, and men wasted away. Amputation was sometimes the only answer. A crushed arm or leg, if left untreated, meant certain death from gangrene. Removing the limb could save a life, though the procedure was brutal and carried its own risks. Without anesthesia, the patient endured agony, held down by comrades as the sword did its work. Survival afterward depended on luck and strength. Many who lived became cripples, forever marked by the field. Head wounds were particularly feared. Helmets protected well, but a blow from a mace or hammer could still crack skulls or cause concussions. Men described seeing stars, losing sight, or falling unconscious, symptoms we now recognize as traumatic brain injury. Some never recovered their wits. Others survived, but with lasting impairments, living reminders of the hidden costs of war. And then there was bleeding. A cut to a major artery was usually fatal, but smaller wounds could bleed for hours, weakening a man until he collapsed. Soldiers knew the importance of pressure, of tying cloth to stem the flow, but even so, many died slowly from blood loss. The cries of the wounded often filled the battlefield long after the clash ended, haunting survivors as they walked among the fallen. After the battle, the true suffering began. Camps overflowed with wounded men. Supplies of bandages, clean water, and food were scarce. Many lay for days without proper treatment, their wounds festering. Infections spread quickly in crowded, filthy conditions. Lice and flies swarmed over open sores. The air stank of blood and decay. For many, death came not in the clash, but in the long, agonizing days afterward. It is worth noting that not all was hopeless. Some medieval healers showed remarkable skill. Monastic infirmaries practiced herbal medicine, using plants like yarrow for clotting, garlic for infection, and willow bark for pain relief. Honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, was applied to wounds. Vinegar was used to clean injuries. These methods did save lives, though success was unpredictable. A soldier might survive one battle thanks to careful care, and another die from a far smaller wound simply because it became infected. Psychological trauma was another silent wound. Chronicles speak of soldiers haunted by visions, unable to sleep, or overcome with fear long after fighting ended. We would now call this post-traumatic stress, but medieval men had no words for it. Some turned to religion for solace, believing their suffering was punishment or a test. Others drank, raged, or withdrew into silence. Survival of the body did not always mean survival of the mind. The battlefield dead themselves posed further danger. Thousands of bodies, left unburied for days, spread disease. Armies often lacked the manpower to bury the fallen properly, and scavenging animals made matters worse. Survivors sometimes found themselves sick not from their wounds but from the rotting air around them. The line between battle injury and battlefield sickness was thin. We should also remember the brutal economy of survival. Nobles taken prisoner were often spared, ransomed back to their families for wealth. Ordinary soldiers, however, were rarely so lucky. If captured, they might be executed, mutilated, or simply abandoned. Survival was tied not only to wounds but to status. The poor bled out in ditches while the rich were carried to safety. And yet, in the midst of this horror, resilience shone through. Men returned from battle with scars that told stories, missing limbs that did not stop them from farming, faces marked forever but spirits unbroken. Communities absorbed their wounded, caring for them as best they could. Life continued, even if altered. The very fact that so many endured shows the strength of the human body and the stubborn will to survive. So, when we think of medieval battles, we should not imagine quick, clean deaths or endless lines of bodies struck down instantly. We should imagine a field groaning with the injured, the slow drip of blood, the stink of wounds, and the cries of men begging for water. We should see surgeons bending over makeshift tables, cauterizing wounds with iron, or tying cloth around shattered limbs. We should see survivors staggering away, scarred but alive, carrying the invisible weight of what they had endured. The battlefield was not just a place of instant death, but of lingering pain. Survival depended on luck, treatment, and resilience more than on the blow itself. And in that fragile line between life and death, we glimpse the true cost of medieval war, not the glory of the charge, but the long, uncertain struggle of the wounded who lived, and the countless who did not. Part 11. Mercenaries and Money. When we picture medieval war, it is tempting to imagine it as a contest of loyalty and honor. Knights ride under the banners of their lords, bound by oaths of fealty, fighting for king, country, or God. It is a romantic picture, and in part, it is true. But beneath the surface of chivalry and heraldry lay another, more practical truth. War was also a business. Armies needed men, and men needed pay. And so the medieval battlefield was filled not only with loyal vassals, but with mercenaries, soldiers for hire, whose allegiance was not to honor or king, but to whoever paid their wages. Money was the lifeblood of medieval war. Raising an army was expensive. Knights had to be equipped with armor, horses, and weapons. Infantry needed food, clothing, and pay. Siege engines cost vast sums to build and maintain. Even simply keeping an army in the field drained treasuries. Kings and lords taxed their subjects heavily, borrowed from bankers, and sometimes pawned estates just to keep soldiers fed. Without coin, no war lasted long. Mercenaries thrived in this world. Across Europe, bands of professional soldiers offered their services to the highest bidder. They were often veterans of earlier campaigns, men hardened by experience and skilled with weapons. Unlike peasant levies, they did not vanish after 40 days of feudal service. They stayed as long as they were paid, fighting wherever contracts took them. This made them invaluable and dangerous. Take the free companies of the 14th century. These groups of mercenaries roamed France during the 100 Years' War, sometimes fighting for kings, sometimes for nobles, and sometimes simply for themselves. When unpaid, they turned to plunder, pillaging villages, and holding towns for ransom. To civilians, they were as feared as any foreign invader. They fought not for causes, but for coin, and their loyalty ended the moment the money did. Italy provides another example. There, city-states like Florence, Milan, and Venice relied heavily on condottieri, mercenary captains who signed contracts, condot, to provide armies. These men were businessmen of war, negotiating terms, setting wages, and changing employers when contracts ended. Some condottieri became so powerful that they ruled cities themselves. Their battles were often carefully staged, with limited bloodshed, because dead soldiers earned no pay. For them, profit was the true prize. Even in kingdoms with strong feudal traditions, mercenaries filled the gaps. Kings of England and France hired archers, crossbowmen, and men-at-arms from abroad. The Scots fought with French gold, the French employed Genoese crossbowmen, English kings recruited Flemish pikemen. War was an international marketplace, where skill in arms was traded like any other commodity. This reliance on money shaped how battles were fought. Commanders had to keep armies paid and supplied. If wages were late, soldiers grew restless. Mutiny was not uncommon. Men deserted, refused to march, or even turned on their employers. Chronicles describe entire companies refusing to fight until their back pay was delivered. The battlefield was not only about courage, but about contracts. Plunder, too, was a form of payment. Soldiers expected the right to loot towns, seize livestock, and take prisoners for ransom. In fact, ransom was one of the most lucrative parts of war. Capturing a wealthy knight or noble could bring more profit than a dozen victories. Ordinary soldiers sometimes struck lucky, dragging a nobleman from the mud and selling him to their captain for ransom. For many, war was less about serving a cause than about the chance of striking rich through plunder and captives. This economy of war blurred the lines of morality. Men who fought bravely one season might turn into brigands the next, raiding the countryside to feed themselves. Villagers often feared their own armies as much as invaders, for both took food, shelter, and goods. To the peasantry, war was a rolling disaster of taxes, raids, and pillaging, whether the men outside their gates wore familiar banners or foreign ones. And yet, mercenaries were indispensable. They provided continuity and professionalism that levies could not. A peasant might serve for 40 days before returning to his fields. A mercenary could serve year-round. He had no crops to tend, no village to sustain, only his sword and his contract. For kings who needed standing forces, mercenaries were the answer. Even the nobility dabbled in mercenary work. Younger sons of knights, without inheritance, often sold their services abroad. Adventurers crossed borders seeking pay. In some cases, entire companies of knights acted as hired armies. Chivalry might dress itself in the language of loyalty, but in practice, coin often guided the sword. This financial reality also meant that wars could collapse as quickly as they began. When money ran out, armies disbanded. Soldiers melted away into the countryside, sometimes joining bandit bands or hiring themselves to new lords. A king without gold could not command loyalty for long. In this sense, the banker and the tax collector were as decisive as the knight and the archer. The presence of mercenaries also changed how war was remembered. Chronicles sometimes sneered at them, accusing them of greed and cowardice. Yet at the same time, they acknowledged their skill. A lord might despise mercenaries in rhetoric, but still hire them when the stakes were high. Their reputation was both feared and necessary, and that tension shaped much of medieval politics. So when we strip away the romantic vision of medieval war, what we see is a landscape of contracts, wages, and deals. Knights swore oaths, yes, but mercenaries signed agreements. Villages were taxed not for glory, but to fill the purses of armies. War was not only a clash of steel, but a market of violence, where loyalty was measured in coin and survival often meant following whoever could pay. Part 12. Women and War. When people imagine medieval war, they tend to picture men on horses, armored knights, and endless ranks of soldiers. Women, in this vision, are almost invisible. They appear only in the background, waiting behind walls, praying for their husband's return, or tending children in villages while the men march away. It is a tidy separation. Men fight, women wait. Yet history is never so simple. The truth is that women played significant roles in medieval warfare, not only as caretakers but as defenders, leaders, and sometimes fighters themselves. Their presence shaped war in ways the myths of knights and battles rarely acknowledge. Let us begin with the most obvious reality. When men marched to war, women held communities together. Villages did not simply stop functioning while armies campaigned. Fields had to be sown, animals tended, and harvests gathered. With husbands, fathers, and sons gone, women managed farms and estates. They organized labor, collected rents, and ensured survival. In this sense, women were the invisible supply chain of war. Without their labor, armies would have returned to famine, and campaigns would have collapsed. Noble women, too, stepped into positions of authority. When lords rode away, their wives often became de facto rulers of castles and estates. They managed defenses, oversaw garrisons, and sometimes took direct command during sieges. Chronicles record many instances where castles were held by women in the absence of their husbands. Margaret of Beverley, for example, is said to have defended Jerusalem during the Crusades, carrying water to fighters and standing on the walls. In France, Jeanne de Clisson turned pirate to avenge her executed husband, harrying enemy ships for years. These are not isolated legends, but part of a wider truth. Women were not always bystanders to war, sometimes they were its leaders. Consider the case of Nicola de la Haye, Castellan of Lincoln Castle in the early 13th century. When rebels besieged the fortress, she commanded its defense personally. Chroniclers noted her resilience and authority, describing her as stubborn as any knight. She endured hunger, fear, and the constant pressure of attack, yet the castle held. In her, we glimpse the reality that noble women were sometimes the last line of defense for entire regions. Even in less exalted positions, women directly took part in war. During sieges, townsfolk of both sexes carried stones to the walls, poured water on fires, and hurled missiles from towers. Some women dressed in men's clothing to join the fight, blending into the ranks. Others were recognized openly, their presence accepted in moments of desperation. In chronicled battles, women are occasionally mentioned among the slain, proof that they stood in harm's way alongside men. Of course, the most famous figure of women in war is Joan of Arc. A teenage peasant girl, she claimed divine visions and led French armies during the 100 Years' War. Her presence inspired troops, revived morale, and turned sieges like that of Orleans into French victories. While her story is exceptional, it reminds us that gender boundaries, while strong, were not absolute. Faith, charisma, and determination could propel a young woman into the heart of war. But beyond such famous examples, women's contributions were constant in less visible ways. They tended the wounded, brewed medicinal herbs, and fed armies. In the camps that followed soldiers, women cooked, washed clothes, and cared for children. Some were wives and daughters, others camp followers earning a living by providing services to soldiers. Their presence was controversial, moralists disapproved, and commanders sometimes tried to drive them away. Yet armies repeatedly tolerated or even relied on them, for without these women, soldiers would have lacked basic care. There were also darker roles. War bred vulnerability, and women were often victims of violence. Chronicles record rapes and abductions during campaigns, grim reminders of how war exposed the powerless. Villages suffered doubly, men killed or conscripted, women violated or enslaved. These traumas rarely appear in romanticized stories, but they were part of the lived reality of war. Economically, women also bore the cost. Taxes fell on households regardless of whether men were present. Widows often carried crushing burdens, responsible for dues and rents while raising children alone. Some were forced to remarry quickly for protection. Others took over businesses or farms by necessity. In either case, war reshaped their lives permanently. Religious rhetoric also involved women in war. Sermons urged mothers to encourage sons to crusade. Wives were told to support husbands in campaigns as part of their duty. At the same time, women themselves joined pilgrimages that blended into wars, walking behind armies, tending the sick, and sometimes taking up crosses themselves. The line between passive support and active involvement blurred again and again. Archaeology even reveals evidence of women's direct involvement. Graves of female skeletons have been found with wounds from weapons, or buried near battle sites, suggesting that some fought and died alongside men. While these cases are few, they remind us that the assumption of women's absence is itself a distortion of history. Even folklore preserves traces of women in war. Ballads tell of maidens who defended castles, wives who avenged husbands, and widows who took up arms. These tales may embellish, but they also reflect real anxieties and memories of women stepping into roles left empty by men. The persistence of these stories across Europe suggests that communities remembered and repeated them because they rang true. It is also important to see how women influenced war without ever wielding weapons. Marriages forged alliances, dowries funded campaigns, and queens acted as diplomats and regents. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, accompanied armies on crusade, and later steered the politics of England and France with a decisiveness that rivaled any general. Power could be exercised through negotiation as much as through the sword. So, when we imagine medieval war, we should not think only of armored knights and faceless peasants. We should also see women hauling buckets to the ramparts, nursing the wounded in smoky tents, negotiating peace as regents, and in rare but striking cases, standing on battlefields themselves. War consumed whole societies, and women were part of that struggle in countless ways, sometimes invisible, sometimes unforgettable. The myth tells us that medieval war was only for men. The truth shows us that women were always there, holding farms together, defending castles, nursing the wounded, leading troops, and enduring the hardships of siege and battle. To see war clearly is to see them too, woven into the fabric of survival and struggle. Part 13. The reality of chivalry. When people hear the word chivalry, they often imagine a shining knight bowing politely to ladies, sparing enemies on the battlefield, and fighting with honor as if war were a noble game. Movies and stories have turned chivalry into a code of courtesy and kindness, a shining contrast to the brutality of medieval war. But the reality of chivalry was far less romantic, and far more complicated. It was not so much a code of kindness as a code of class. Chivalry, at its core, was a set of ideals developed among the knightly elite. It emphasized loyalty to one's lord, bravery in battle, generosity toward peers, and devotion to the Christian faith. Knights were taught that they should protect the weak, defend the church, and conduct themselves with honor. These ideals were celebrated in poetry and song, shaping the image of the knight as a noble warrior. But ideals rarely matched reality. On the battlefield, chivalry often applied only to other knights, men of the same social class. Sparing a noble opponent made sense because he could be ransomed for wealth. Extending mercy to a peasant Levi, on the other hand, gained nothing. Common soldiers were more often slaughtered than spared. Chivalry, in practice, was a code of privilege. Consider the treatment of prisoners. A captured knight might be fed, clothed, and held in relative comfort while negotiations for his ransom dragged on. Chronicles describe noble captives dining at the same table as their captors, sometimes even forging friendships. A captured peasant soldier, however, was likely killed on the spot. There was no financial incentive to keep him alive, and no code of honor extended to him. In this sense, chivalry was less about mercy than about economics and status. Chivalry also coexisted uneasily with the brutality of war. Knights were perfectly capable of burning villages, looting towns, and killing civilians when it served their cause. The same knight who swore to protect the weak might lead a raid that left peasants starving. During the 100 Years' War, English and French forces alike ravaged the countryside in chevauchés, campaigns of deliberate destruction designed to starve the enemy. Chivalry did little to restrain this. The Church tried to shape chivalry into a tool of morality. Movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God sought to limit violence, forbidding knights from attacking churches, peasants, or non-combatants on certain days. Crusades were framed as holy wars, encouraging knights to channel their violence toward just causes. Yet even in crusades, the slaughter of civilians was common. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099, in which crusaders massacred tens of thousands, hardly fits the ideal of protecting the innocent. Chivalry was invoked, but often ignored. Tournaments provide another window into the gap between myth and reality. In poetry, jousts are portrayed as graceful contests of skill and honor, where knights tested themselves before noble ladies. In practice, early tournaments were violent melees in which dozens of knights fought across open fields, capturing and ransoming each other. Deaths were common, injuries constant, and the line between sport and war blurred. Chivalry was present, yes, but so were profit and brutality. It is also worth noting that chivalry was deeply tied to appearances. Knights were expected to dress richly, display coats of arms, and ride fine horses. To look noble was as important as to act noble. A knight's reputation depended on being seen as generous and brave, even if his actions behind the scenes told a different story. Much of chivalry was performance, reinforced by songs, poems, and chronicles written for noble patrons. And yet, we should not dismiss chivalry entirely. For all its flaws, it did shape behavior. Knights did sometimes spare enemies, aid comrades, and show restraint. Codes of conduct encouraged men to see themselves as more than hired killers. Chivalry gave meaning to lives spent in violence, offering a story that knights could tell themselves about why they fought. In a brutal world, it was at least an attempt, however flawed, to place limits on war. But it was never a universal code. Chivalry did not protect peasants, townsfolk, or the poor. It was not a shield for civilians caught in the path of armies. It was, instead, a code of the elite, one that bound knights to each other more than to the wider society they claimed to defend. The contrast between myth and reality can be seen most clearly in literature. The Arthurian romances of the 12th century painted knights as paragons of courtesy, devotion, and loyalty. Yet the chronicles of real wars describe burned villages, massacred garrisons, and endless suffering. The gap between the knight of story and the knight of history is wide, but both coexisted in the medieval imagination. For the ordinary soldier or peasant, chivalry was almost invisible. What they experienced was not noble mercy, but hard taxation, raids, and the brutal indifference of armies. For them, the knight was not a hero but a predator, consuming their crops and demanding their service. Chivalry did little to ease their suffering. So when we think of medieval chivalry, we should be cautious. It was not the universal code of kindness that legend suggests. It was a class-based system of ideals, often honored more in word than in deed. Knights lived by it when convenient, ignored it when not, and justified their actions through it regardless. The myth of chivalry gives us knights of storybook honor, shining in courtesy and grace. The reality was messier, a code for the few, often betrayed in practice, yet still powerful as an ideal. Chivalry was never the heart of medieval war, but it was its mask, a way for violence to dress itself in nobility, even when the truth was blood, fire, and ruin. Part 14. Battles that never happened like you think. When we think of medieval battles, certain names rise instantly to mind: Hastings, Agincourt, Crecy. These battles have become symbols of the Middle Ages, retold in schoolbooks, films, and national legends. They seem clear and simple, moments of destiny where knights clashed, arrows flew, and kings sealed their fates in a few hours of combat. But the reality of these battles was far less tidy. They were messy, uncertain, and often very different from the myths that grew around them. Let us begin with the Battle of Hastings in 1066, one of the most famous encounters in English history. Popular imagination paints it as a straight clash between William the Conqueror's Normans and Harold Godwinson's Saxons. We picture armored knights charging a solid shield wall, arrows flying overhead, and the Saxons slowly crumbling under relentless attack. The famous story that Harold was killed by an arrow in the eye adds to the drama. Yet much of this picture is myth. For one thing, The arrow in the eye story is uncertain. It may have been propaganda or later embellishment. Some sources suggest Harold was cut down by Norman knights in close combat, not felled by a lucky shot. The famous Bayeux tapestry itself is ambiguous, showing a figure struck by an arrow and another struck down by a sword, leaving historians unsure which was Harold. The shield wall, too, was not an impenetrable block of men but a living, shifting formation. Saxons fought mostly on foot with axes and spears, holding the high ground. Norman cavalry attacked repeatedly but were initially repelled. At one point, parts of the Norman army fled, whether from panic or from William's cunning feigned retreat remains debated. Saxon troops, thinking victory at hand, broke formation to pursue, and that moment of disorder allowed the Normans to counterattack. Hastings was not the clean sweep of knights triumphing through sheer force. It was a battle of endurance, confusion, and chance. Now let us turn to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, immortalized by Shakespeare and countless films. The legend tells of a small English army, outnumbered by overwhelming French forces, winning through courage and the deadly accuracy of their longbowmen. We imagine knights stuck in the mud, falling helplessly before endless flights of arrows, while King Henry V delivers stirring speeches to inspire his men. The truth is less romantic. The English were indeed outnumbered, but not by the impossible margins sometimes claimed. Their victory came not just from courage but from clever positioning and French mistakes. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by woods, forcing the French to attack head-on with little room to maneuver. Heavy rain had turned the ground into mud, and when armored French knights charged, they became bogged down. Pushed from behind by their own men, they fell into heaps, unable to rise. English archers, armed not only with bows but with mallets and knives, waded into the mess and finished off knights who could not fight back. This was not the glorious duel of noble warriors, but a grim scene of suffocation, trampling, and mud. French knights drowned in the press, crushed by their comrades. Many were killed while helpless on the ground. The longbow played a vital role, but victory came as much from terrain, exhaustion, and confusion as from arrows. Shakespeare gave us poetry, history gives us mud and chaos. Crecy, fought in 1346, tells a similar story. The English longbow is often credited with single-handedly deciding the battle, mowing down waves of French knights. In truth, Crecy was a clash shaped by discipline, timing, and French disorganization. The French attacked in waves without coordination, allowing the English to repel them piecemeal. Geno's crossbowmen hired by the French were forced to fight without proper support, their pavises left behind, their strings damp from rain. When they faltered, French knights trampled them in their rush forward. Chaos, pride, and poor planning handed the English their victory as much as the bowstrings did. Even smaller, less famous battles were often mythologized beyond recognition. Chroniclers, eager to flatter kings and lords, exaggerated numbers, glorified victories, and minimized defeats. A skirmish where a few hundred men clashed could be described as a grand battle of thousands. A victory achieved through luck might be rewritten as the will of God. A defeat might be glossed over or blamed on treachery. History was not just recorded, it was spun. The result is that many of the great battles we imagine were not singular, clean moments of destiny but messy struggles full of missteps, chance, and misunderstanding. They were shaped by weather, terrain, and panic as much as by bravery and skill. Leaders were not always in control. Soldiers often acted on impulse. And victories came less from perfect plans than from exploiting mistakes. For the men who fought in them, these battles did not feel like legendary events. They felt like chaos. A Saxon at Hastings did not know he was living through the birth of Norman England. He only knew he was exhausted, holding a shield, and praying not to be struck. An archer at Agincourt did not hear Henry's famous speech. He heard the squelch of mud, the snap of bowstrings, and the crash of armored men collapsing into the mire. A French knight at Crecy did not see the future of warfare changing. He only saw the arrows blotting out the sky and wondered if he would make it through alive. The myths that came later turned these battles into symbols of national pride, of heroic kings, of divine favor. But the reality on the ground was sweat, mud, fear, and exhaustion. The clash of nations was, for the soldiers, simply the struggle to survive another hour. The great battles of the Middle Ages were not the polished, noble duels of legend. They were messy, uncertain, and often won through confusion, mud, and chance. To see them clearly is to strip away the poetry and find the men beneath, tired, frightened, and caught in storms far larger than themselves. Part 15. The End of the Medieval Battlefield. For centuries, the medieval battlefield was shaped by the clash of knights, the press of spear walls, the grind of sieges, and the thunder of cavalry. It was a world of banners and heraldry, of castles looming over fields, of archers loosing arrows into the sky. But nothing in history stays the same forever. By the late Middle Ages, the old ways of war were changing. Slowly at first, then decisively, the battlefield that had defined Europe for centuries gave way to something new, a world of gunpowder, cannons, and professional armies. The story of this transformation begins not with knights, but with powder and flame. Gunpowder arrived in Europe in the 13th century, likely through contacts with the Islamic world and China. At first, it seemed like a curiosity, noisy, smoky, and unreliable. Early cannons were more likely to frighten than to kill. They burst unexpectedly, fired inaccurately, and required great care to use. But technology never stands still. By the 15th century, cannons had grown larger, more reliable, and far more deadly. And castles, once the symbols of power and security, began to crumble before them. A wall that could withstand endless waves of arrows or the blows of a trebuchet could not stand long against gunpowder artillery. Stone shattered under cannon fire, towers collapsed, and gatehouses splintered. No matter how thick the walls, the thunder of iron shot could bring them down. Sieges that once dragged on for months could now be decided in days. This shift did not happen overnight. For many decades, cannons and older engines like trebuchets existed side by side. But each year, artillery improved. By the late 15th century, no lord could ignore it. Castles were redesigned with lower, thicker walls angled to deflect cannonballs. Star forts with bastions emerged, shaping the battlefields of the Renaissance. The age of the tall medieval castle was ending. Gunpowder also changed battles in the open field. Handheld firearms, primitive at first, slowly grew more common. Early handguns were clumsy, fired with a match, and often missed their target. Yet they terrified enemies with their noise, smoke, and armor-piercing power. A knight who could shrug off arrows found that lead balls punched through plate. Armorers tried to adapt, thickening steel, but this only made armor heavier and more expensive. By the 16th century, full-plate armor was no longer practical, and knights abandoned it. This spelled the decline of the knightly class as masters of war. For centuries, heavily armored cavalry had dominated the battlefield. But gunpowder reduced their advantage. Infantry armed with pikes, supported by guns, could hold back cavalry charges. Battles like the Swiss victories against Burgundian knights in the late 15th century showed that disciplined infantry could defeat mounted elites. The balance of power shifted away from the individual knight toward the coordinated mass. Money, too, reshaped warfare. We have seen how mercenaries were central to medieval armies, but in the late Middle Ages, states began building more permanent, professional forces. Kings of France, Spain, and later England raised standing armies, paid directly from royal treasuries. These soldiers were not bound by feudal duty but by wages. They drilled regularly, carried standardized weapons, and followed central commands. The age of part-time peasant levies faded. In their place rose the beginnings of modern armies. Chivalry, already fraying, grew increasingly irrelevant. On a battlefield dominated by gunpowder, there was little room for individual duels or gestures of knightly honor. A bullet did not care for coats of arms. A cannonball did not distinguish noble from peasant. The ideals of the code still lived in literature and ceremony, but in practice, war became more impersonal, more mechanical, and more deadly. This did not mean the end of courage, nor of horror. Battles were still bloody, sieges still starved cities, and soldiers still endured fear and exhaustion. But the shape of that fear was different. The thunder of hooves gave way to the thunder of cannon. The hiss of arrows became the crack of gunfire. The battlefield filled with smoke, the air choking with the smell of sulfur. To a soldier raised in the old ways, it must have felt like the world itself was changing. For civilians, too, the change was immense. Gunpowder wars demanded more money, more taxes, and more centralized states. Kings raised new revenues to pay for artillery and permanent troops. Banking houses in Italy financed campaigns. War became not only a matter of lords and knights, but of entire economies. The medieval patchwork of feudal obligation gave way to the beginnings of state-controlled military power. And yet, in all this change, traces of the old world lingered. Knights still fought, banners still flew, and castles still stood. But their meaning shifted. A knight on horseback might still ride into battle, but he did so as part of a formation, not as an individual hero. A castle might still house a lord, but it was less fortress than symbol, beautiful but vulnerable. The Middle Ages faded not with a single moment, but with a slow transformation, one in which the battlefield was never the same again. If we look back at the long sweep of medieval warfare, from the shield walls of Hastings to the mud of Agincourt, what we see is a world that balanced myth and reality. Knights dreamed of chivalry, but fought with brutality. Battles were remembered as legends, but lived as chaos. Weapons were celebrated in song, but feared in life. And through it all, ordinary people bore the heaviest burden. Peasants, archers, laborious, women, children, all caught in the storm of history. The end of the medieval battlefield reminds us of something important, that no way of war lasts forever. Every weapon, every fortress, every tactic eventually meets its match. Gunpowder brought an end to the age of knights, just as later technologies would bring an end to pikes, muskets, and cannons. The battlefield is always changing, and with it, the lives of those forced to fight. The Middle Ages gave us the myths of knights and castles, but its wars were fought with confusion, hunger, and fear. And in the end, even that world passed away, swept aside by fire, powder, and steel. To look back on the medieval battlefield is not to see a world of glory, but a world of change, and to remember that even the strongest walls, like the strongest myths, cannot stand forever.